800 years of British occupation. Yeah, I've opened up that can of worms, I have. And don't get me wrong, I fully understand what people mean when they are screaming at the top of their voice, possibly in a few places in Ireland, a few pubs, so on and so forth. What they mean when they're saying 800 years of British occupation. What they're trying to say is that for 800 years the English have been harassing us and pretty much being a nuisance to us, and that we kind of want them to stop, and we've decided to start screaming 800 years of British occupation. And that it isn't what it is, and that is that the British for 800 years have occupied Ireland. That's not what it really means. But, like most things, if you say it over and over and over again, it eventually becomes true, it becomes the truth. And the problem is, I've spent 10 years on the internet, and for those 10 years, I have had endless amount of people from all over the world cannot understand why I have an interest in Irish medieval history. And when I question and delve into why wouldn't I be interested in Irish medieval history, they kind of ponder to themselves, like, Irish medieval history, like nothing really happens. The English come over and they take over the country, and that's it. That's the end of Irish medieval history. And I think to myself, no, that's not true. That's not true at all. What happens is that you have a Norman invasion in 1169. The Normans come in and they take so much territory and they take so much land, but then eventually they're slowed down and they're halted. And this is what the point we call the Gaelic resurgence, which happens in 1260. So the Norman invasion happens in 1169, and then it's eventually grinded down and slowed down in 1260. And then you can see the start of the Gaelic resurgence, where the Gaelic start to push back against the Normans. And as part of the Gaelic resurgence as well, we have the Scottish-Norwegian War that kicks off. Then we have the Scottish War of Independence. And before you know it, we're dragged into the 100 Years' War with England. And a very interesting thing happens. Edward III basically just turns around to the Irish barons and look after yourself. You know, I'm focusing on France. And because they have a mixture of the Magna Carta and Edward III quite literally says that, that's what the Irish Parliament do. They start to become more independent away from England. They have a very mixed relationship. It's not very black and white, and it is grey. I will agree on that. If you look at the south, east of Ireland, you have the development of the Anglo-Irish, people who are literally English as English can be, all the way to proud Gaelic independent men, the Gallowglass, the Kerns, so on and so forth. And these people come from all forms of society. You literally have the Fitzgeralds, for example. One branch, the Kildare Fitzgeralds, are both proud of their Irish side and their English side. The mixture of both worlds, compared to the Desmond Fitzgeralds, who were very Gaelic. In fact, they completely rewrite their own history and say, hey, we were never a part of those Normans. In fact, we were from Florence. And I'm not even making that up. They start off an entire Irish Renaissance because they start connecting themselves with Florence, the birthplace of the Renaissance. And I suppose if you're rewriting your own history because you want to be detached from England, of course, why not pick the best families in Europe at the time, the very people who have now given birth to the Renaissance, the rebirth of the Roman Empire after they collapsed into a dark age. So that's what the Desmond Fitzgeralds do, and the Kildare Fitzgeralds jump right on top of that as well, because they're like, well, of course we're related to all these Florence families. And so what you have is a very complicated story, but it's not a story where the British government has been occupying us throughout our entire medieval history. All that stuff I just said is all a part of Ireland's history. It's history that Ireland was a part of, and that's even before that. Interesting in itself, of course. But the thing I want to highlight is that if you keep saying something, it becomes true. So I think we need to start to disarm this kind of defensive attitude we've had and start to go back and bring up our history, because we're starting to get a point where Irish people are really starting to believe in this 800 years of occupation. Because when I go back and I ask these people, hey, like, where are you getting this information from? They're getting it from other Irish people, because other Irish people, especially young people today, who barely even cover medieval history, in fact, they don't really cover it at all. The amount of young people I've come across who do not have any, they're just not interested in Irish medieval history because they say it's boring because it's occupied by the English. The English come in and they take over the country. And I've just pointed out that's not really true. In fact, we start to push them out as far as Dublin. And because the Fitzgeralds take over the administration of Dublin, one could debate that it was really under Irish control. Furthermore, although you have the Statutes of Kilkenny, everybody in Dublin is speaking Irish. They may consider themselves English because they're civilized, but they're speaking Irish, you know? Just food for thought. You know, these are all things are just for food for thought. But regardless, after 1460, Ireland for the most part is completely independent from the English crown. And during the 100 Years' War, don't get me wrong, like 1460, that irritates the English. The English want to reoccupy and take over Ireland once again. And they get that opportunity in 1534 with the Silk and Thomas Rebellion. Regardless, everything I'm saying right here and what you need to take note of is here. There's a lot of history going on, and it's amazing history. We're not occupied by the English. We're making our own weapons. We have our own blacksmiths. There's a whole family called the Smiths who live in Ireland, who make armor, they make weapons. It's not a case of us just taking up arms because we're a bunch of ignorant barbarians living on the fringes of this new English occupied society. That's not the case. As I said just there, we have connections with Rome, you know. So it can be very frustrating when I'm talking to other Irish people and they have this very much like, but we were occupied for 800 years. And so you're asking yourself at this point, where did this come from? Well, it comes from 1920. And this goes back to what I said original. The people who said this, they didn't actually mean it. They were just saying it out of frustration against the British. You occupied my country for 800 years. And don't get me wrong, I understand what they're saying. It's annoying to go through Irish medieval history, and just when we want to live, the English are on top of us for just doing basic stuff. I could easily find a good example of this. Art MacMoragh during the 100 Years' War, a person who would actually given good service to the English, who just wanted to marry an English woman. Because he's Gaelic, his wife ends up having her lands taken and stripped from her. And she ends up getting fined and penalties and so on and so forth for being an English woman marrying a Gaelic man, and native Irish. That's disgraceful. You know, so when someone turns around and says for 800 years you've done this, and they've gone to the next point, I'm not undermining the aggression that's coming out of it. I'm just trying to kind of undo the actual word in itself, because it's been said so much, we're starting to actually believe we've been occupied by the British for 800 years. In fact, the British have no problems turning around and saying, the British government that is, to turn around and say, hey, you're practically one of us now. And looking at Ukraine, we don't like it when other countries turn around and say, oh, well, you're practically one of us. We're not. The Irish identity is completely separate from the English one. And I have nothing against English people. In fact, as you know yourself, I recently had an Englishman on the channel this week. Many people who are helping me out with this channel are English. A lot of people are. And as I said there, one of my examples is an English woman who was stripped of her lands because she wanted to marry a Gaelic man. And that's the frustration here. That's the annoyance, that when somebody says, you have irritated me for 800 years, occupied my country for 800 years, it's not a, how we say, they don't actually mean it. They're having to go off the British government itself, that there was a system in place for 800 years has really frustrated and annoyed us. The problem is the wording has just become too much, you know? So that's it really. That's pretty much what the main points I want to make about this 800 years myth. People in 1920 who were writing the history books, they didn't really get too much wrong. Their interpretation may be off compared to modern standards, but they pretty much knew what they were saying. The problem is that they've been saying it for so long that we actually believe in this stuff, and it can get quite dangerous when you've got the likes of the Dublin City Council pouring tarmac all over Viking history just because it's seen as foreign, or when Irish people are just looking at every single castle in Ireland as a form of occupation, when they should be looking at the full story, how these castles were put in place and then slowly but surely over time had become Gaelicised. In fact, the majority of castles in Ireland aren't even Norman castles. The Normans were building Mount and Bailey castles for the most part, given that Trim Castle, that's an English castle, but all the other ones, they're all Gaelic castles. They were all built during the Gaelic Renaissance when Ireland was starting to boom up. So, you know, if that's not enough stuff to turn you around and say, hey, look, our history is actually really gorgeous, it's really beautiful, and the problem is that we've been stamping on our own history so much that we think we're the savages that just run around in Scottish kilts all day, half naked, covered in tattoos, living in bog standard tiny little homes, and that we're the savages to the English. And then you're just believing in English politics of the medieval period, which was used to justify to commit both genocides against the Irish, and for any English person that wanted to live a normal, decent life, marrying into a Gaelic family, to have his rights and dignities stripped from him is completely disgraceful behaviour. And it's something that when we go into the Renaissance with the arrival of Gaelic assemblies and the Irish Parliament for the Anglo-Irish, it's something that unified they're completely against. They're sick of this attitude of them not being able to marry or take on any form of rights or culture that they wanted. And this, at the end of the medieval period, becomes something that the Irish really push for, unified. Both the Anglo-Irish and the Gaelic, the native Irish, they become unified and become the Irish people. And that's how we identify ourselves today, that we're fighting for the liberties of our own country. So when somebody turns around and say, the British have occupied us for 800 years, they don't actually mean the British government. What they're meaning is what the English monarchy originally was representing in Ireland, and that's the statutes of Kilkenny and later on Poyning's Law that would strip people living in Ireland of their own rights and dignity. That's what the Irish were fighting against. It doesn't mean that the British actually occupied us. The British occupy us much later on, and it's a continuous fight within the country until eventually 1916 kicks in, which we have this weekend, another some more, anniversary to when we finally got our dignities and rights back from the British government that had denied it for so long, basic human rights. English people should have the right to move to Ireland and not be harassed and annoyed by the British government of all people. It's Ireland, not Britain. And I'm not trying to undermine anybody here, but come on. You should actually have the right to marry who you want. And I know I'm slightly passionate about it, but if you haven't noticed, I love history. Anyway, I have waffled enough. My main point is that instead of saying 800 years, probably understand what exactly someone's saying about it. That's why at the same time I'm not trying to undermine it. I'm just saying it's not really 800 years of British occupation. What it is 800 years of the English problem in Ireland. And when somebody says, what is that problem? It's the problem that they won't let us have our basic rights and dignity. And it's not towards English people. It's towards the English government who denied those rights. Because there are English people, and we do have examples of it. I just used the example of Art McMurray's wife because she's just a basic one. And hopefully you agree. Art McMurray's wife is one example. The Gaelic, on the other hand, Gaelic are treated so subhuman that there's one point where a poor Gaelic man is put into a bag and they think it's hilarious and funny just to kick him to death. It's a human being. And that's acceptable in the medieval period. And don't get me wrong, I'm not holding it against modern English people, because you have to remember at the end of the day, that's the medieval era. And that's going completely off my point. McCarthy's did the same to the Normans when they first came in. They skinned them alive. Also not acceptable behaviour, but it's the medieval period. But that's not my point. My point is that instead of saying 800 years, it should be 800 years of the English problem in Ireland. Anyway, thanks very much, guys, and all the best.